Hello, and welcome to Douglas Weekly. Thanks for joining me today. Today I'm going to talk about gun violence as there has been a spate of gun shootings in the US, specifically the Dallas shooting. Over the last 2 weeks, two African American men were shot by police in the US under very controversial circumstances. Coincidentally, the Black Lives Matter movement had a peaceful demonstration in Dallas a couple of days after the event. During the event, the crowd was fired upon. Police officers supervising the event were focused on. Multiple officers were wounded, and 5 police officers killed. The known suspect, Micah Johnson, was killed, a 25-year-old African American Army veteran. In his communications with the police during the attack and in past social media writings, he noticed his frustration with police brutality on African Americans and wanted revenge by killing some white policemen. Even though not all the details are clear, it's not hard to see a pattern emerging with all these mass shootings, and I think it's clear to many people. Here's the pattern. A disturbed individual or group takes advantage of the ample gun supply. A country that has less than 5% of the world's population, but has 25 to 35% of civilian-owned guns. They stock an arsenal and then go attack their targets of scorn, be it cops, African Americans, university students, women, men, soldiers, Planned Parenthood, non-Muslims. It's a wide variety of groups that have been targeted, and I don't think these mass shootings specifically concentrate on any group or spectrum in politics. As shocking and as horrible as these mass shooters are, they are distracting from a far more larger pressing issue. The vast majority of gun deaths in the US are either more conventional murders or suicide. It's not some crazy shooter mowing down a movie theater, but regular, consistent murders. And this has led to an unusually high gun death rate compared to most countries. In most developed industrial states, cars kill far more people than guns. But in the US, guns kill about as many people. Here is an excerpt from CBS News to give you a sense of the extreme gun violence in the US. Americans are 10 times more likely to be killed by guns than people in other developed countries, a new study finds. Compared to 22 other high-income nations, the United States gun-related murder rate is 25 times higher. And even though the United States suicide rate is similar to other countries, the nation's gun-related suicide rate is 8 times higher than other high-income countries, researchers said. I'm not going to go into the whole gun control debate. My layman thoughts are that a smaller supply of guns and a stronger set of regulations would decrease violence. But I'm no expert. And I realize it's not a simple case of all gun control ideas being good. Some are probably going to be more effective, some are going to be less effective, some are going to be completely unconstructive. This is not relevant to what I want to discuss today. What I want to discuss is it's clear that there is an extreme and unusual amount of murders and gun deaths in the US. This is a widely discussed and debated topic, but it's often discussed from the angle of a tragic individual story, like the death of the school children at Sandy Hook, the impact on living standards or life expectancies, or the gun violence impact on specific communities like marginalized African American communities. Today, I want to look at it on a larger national level. What could this unusually extreme gun violence be doing to the United States as a national state? Is this undermining US citizens' sense of security in the US? If so, would this affect the United States' legitimacy and the support of its inhabitants? Many thinkers have explored the relationship between a nation-state's legitimacy and its provision of security and order to its inhabitants. In the 17th century, a famous political philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, argued that inhabitants give sovereignty, the right of rule, to a ruler for security. Basically argued without a strong, powerful ruler, human society would be brutish, violent, and unpleasant, as no one would be forced to follow the rules, hence chaos and mass violence. For him, a very influential time in his life was watching the Civil War in England. This really affected his thought and why you needed a central government to control the violence. So what happens if the ruler, be it a king, democratically elected government, can no longer provide that security? The support for the current regime and values starts to wane. The people want security and they will look for other alternatives, be it different type of government or a change in values. 9/11 in the US was a good example of this. Americans felt insecure and were more willing to support increased surveillance, torture. Basically, go back on a lot of supposed values of the traditional American system that made it so, my fingers are making air quotes here, special. So, security is an important requirement for a nation state like the US to maintain obedience from its inhabitants. Max Weber, a very influential sociologist, argued that this was a prerequisite for a functional nation state. In a lecture, Politics as a Vocation, he said, "A state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory." So Max Weber would argue that for the United States to be a functional state, it needs to monopolize the means of force within its borders. So, following Max Weber's idea, how do nation states monopolize force and violence? Well, they grant the right to use violence and access to specific groups. So in the US, it's the police and military, for the most case, who are regulated by strict laws, or at least in theory, in their use of violence. Through a combination of laws and coercion, the US and coercion can dominate anybody who tries to oppose their rule within the territory of the US, and that legitimates their use of violence. So basically, people know that they cannot oppose the military might of the US. And they also know that if they behave, things will be better. It's kind of a carrot sticks thing. Restricting weapon access is a common way for nation states to maintain their monopoly of physical violence. It makes it much easier to control the application of violence. In Dallas, some protesters were openly carrying guns. This made it harder for the police to control their use of force, as it created further confusion of who the attackers were. When the shooting started, the cops couldn't just assume anyone with a gun was an attacker. This is an example how increased access to weapons weakens the use of force for the state. And I think it's a useful way to find nation states around the world and define what's a functional nation state. There are a myriad of states with all different types of governments, economic systems, cultures, and behaviors. So it's really kind of interesting to say, well, what makes these seemingly very different nation states the same? What's the commonality between a North Korea, a Sweden, a Bolivia? They all have monopolized violence. The rulers of those states all decide how to mete out force and violence, who can mete out the force and violence, and when they can mete out the force and violence. Maybe they use this violence through the police, through the army, through hired thugs. Maybe they allow private citizens to use violence. Like many nation states, grant people the right of self-defense and right to protect property. Key thing is the ruling government or ruler of that state decides it. And this is a very useful way to distinguish countries that have modern nation states from failed or non-existent nation states. Take examples of two very different nation states, Sweden and North Korea. Both have central authorities that control the means of violence. The army and police are subservient to the governments in both these countries. They are functional nation states. Now, one uses force and violence in a way that can create a very high living standard. It creates a lot of peace and limits the violence. The other one uses its force and violence to repress its population and concentrate all the wealth at the top. But both have monopolized their force and violence. Conversely, non-existent to functional states such as the Democratic Republic of Congo usually find it very difficult to monopolize violence and force. Here's an excerpt from an article in Foreign Policy called The Invisible State, which explains how the Democratic Republic of Congo has failed to monopolize violence and is a non-functional state. And in today's Congo, let's be clear, there is no sovereign power at all outside the urban areas, leaving 2/3 of the country's estimated 75 million people beyond the purview of a central government. In November 2012, the M23 rebel group seemingly walked past UN peacekeepers to occupy Goma, capital of North Kivu province. After mocking the Congolese state, the rebels left 10 days later and melted in the forest, but they clearly showed they could return at will. Now, the monopoly of legitimate violence isn't an all-or-nothing binary thing. A great place to get a sense of the functionality or stability of a state is the Fragile State Index. You will see some countries like Mexico who are middle ranked in the stability. Mexico has drug trade violence issues, and this means that a lot of the violence that happens state is out of the control of the government. Hence, Mexico is less stable than other places. Now, you might think that the monopoly of violence sounds like a really bad thing. It suggests very dark ideas and brings up dark images of repressive totalitarian regimes, North Korea, Stalinist Russia. But this can be a very positive thing compared to the alternative, as we discussed with Thomas Hobbes earlier. In societies without a state to regulate violence, there is often anarchy. There is no higher organization to dissuade people from robbing and harming each other, and there is no effective conflict resolution. For justice, people have to resort to vigilantism and revenge. Blood feuds are very likely. As a result, there is a lot of violence. Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steels illustrates this problem quite well as he discussed his friend's experience, his friend is Doug, with New Guinea nomads called the Fayou. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. The Fayou lived as single families scattered throughout the swamp and come together once or twice a year to negotiate the exchange of brides. Doug's visit coincided with such a gathering of a few dozen Fayou. To us, a few dozen people constitute a small, ordinary gathering, but to the Fayou, it was a rare, frightening event. Murderers suddenly found themselves face to face with victims' families. One Fayou man spotted the man who killed his father. The son raised his axe and rushed at the murderer, but was wrestled to the ground by friends. Then the murderer came at the prostrate son with an axe and was also wrestled down. Other men periodically shouted at each other, shook with anger and frustration, and pounded the ground with axes. The Fayou consist of 400 hunter-gatherers divided into 4 clans wandering over a few hundred square miles. According to their own account, they had formerly numbered about 2,000, but their population had been greatly reduced as a result of Fayou killing Fayou. It does sound quite grim. I feel fortunate to be Canadian, have a government that limits the type of weapons that everyday citizens can have, has tools of violence to dissuade crime and violence, and a democratic rule of law that resolves conflict. So I know if I'm a victim of crime, I don't have to get a weapon and do it myself for revenge. For the most part, I can trust the Canadian system. Now, is the high degree of small arms ownership in the United States undermining its monopoly on violence? By allowing gun ownership on such a high level and often having low safety standards, it is allowing the informal arming of its citizenry with small weapons to a degree that few states, and no industrialized states, do. Is it turning into a situation kind of like the Fayou excerpt? With so many people armed, is it undermining the U.S. government maintaining peace and minimizing violence during conflict? The informal arming of the U.S. is very interesting when put in a historical context of how nation-states or political organizations arm their populations. Traditionally, arms and military training was either the exclusive domain or dominant domain of the elite of society. A great example of this is Tokugawa Japan when they made contact with Europe. Contact with Europe meant access to guns, a new, superior weapon. But elites were not happy about this. Their identity was highly invested in ritualized dueling with sophisticated Japanese poetry and quips to boot. Guns totally messed up this battle system. Nothing ruins your smooth recitation of poetry and daring dueling than some yokel with a gun blasting you mid-sentence. That simply would not do. As a result, the samurai-controlled government restricted gun access and production till there were barely any functional guns in the country. Swords and weapons were restricted to warrior elite. This is a very traditional form of the monopolization of force or violence by the state. The French Revolution was the next stage where access to military training and weapons was open to the masses. However, it wasn't a complete free-for-all. Rather, masses were given the chance to join the military. By opening it to the masses, it meant more soldiers, more manpower, and also opportunities to increase the quality of the officers as there was larger competition for senior roles. However, troops were controlled and directed by the state. And this is key. They were still armed in an intentional manner by the state. So for the most part, the state controlled where and when the violence enforced happened. Whether the informal arming of the US population is intentional or not, or just a result of businesses trying to sell as many weapons as possible, it now represents the next stage in arming the population. The population arms themselves with guns, not funded by the state, not directed, and not controlled. And since the state cannot or will not control the arming of its inhabitants, the state can't control who the population will direct their violence against. And this becomes very obvious in mass shooter situations. These guys arm up, start shooting up places, and authorities cannot seem to reduce the frequency of these occurrences. And that is not even the majority of gun-related deaths in the US. Most are suicides or more conventional murders. The US is either unwilling or unable to lower its unusually high murder rate and gun death rate. As a result of this arming, citizens find it much easier to exercise large-scale violence and express their political and social grievances through violence rather than peaceful conflict resolution and political action. Joshua Holland wrote a powerful illustration of this point in his article, Dallas Shooter Micah Johnson Showed What NRA's Insurgency Theory of Gun Rights Really Looks Like. In his article, he argues that the Dallas shooter, Micah Johnson, his rationales and actions, as wrong and as twisted as they are consistent with a commonly held belief in the United States, the insurgency theory. He writes, in Dallas last week, Micah Johnson offered a real-world example of a law-abiding citizen taking up arms to fight what he perceived to be a government that was trampling the rights of its citizens. In reality, it looked like a bloody mass murder of a bunch of cops who were just doing their jobs. But make no mistake, Johnson was acting on one of the central beliefs that animates the gun right movement. It's been called the insurgency theory of the Second Amendment, and it holds that Americans must have the right to own military-style weapons because a heavily armed populace is the last bulwark against a tyrannical government running amok. The NRA is quite explicit about this. In 1998, Charles Heston gave a speech to the National Press Club shortly after being named the president of the NRA that's since become famous among gun rights activists. I say that the Second Amendment is, in order of importance, the First Amendment, he told gathered reporters. It is America's first freedom, the one that protects all of the others, because there is no such thing as a free nation where police and military are allowed the force of arms, but the individual citizens are not. He called the right to bear arms the right we turn to when all else fails. Right there, this is a theory that the government should not have a monopoly of violence and force, and citizens are armed to undermine that monopoly. And I think this theory runs a risky assumption that a parity of lots of small armed groups will lead to a system of justice and stability. If this was true, wouldn't Somalia be a great place to live right now, as there are lots of citizens armed and the central government is no match against all these armed groups? If a nation state does not have a monopoly of violence, why should its inhabitants obey the state? Why should they follow the conflict resolution, the courts, when they can ignore them because they are armed enough to do this? We see this situation in many countries, like Jamaica, where street gangs run independent fiefdoms in tough cities like Kingston. The United States seems unable to rein in this gun violence, or at least at a much worse way than other comparable rich modern nation states. Gun sales rise after mass shootings. This is a possible sign that citizens feel the US government is unable to protect them and they need to protect themselves. Maybe they turn to each other for protection instead of the police. Problem is, history shows that military power intended for protection eventually gets used for offensive political means. This happens with local groups who lack protection and arm themselves. Eventually they become criminal gangs, armies, militias. If this gun violence continues, how long will it be till gun-owning people start to organize and create their own groups for defense? How long till some enterprising politicians start to work with these groups to reach their political ends? Again, you can see this in Jamaica, where the government works with these, gangs to make sure they get enough votes. And likewise, in the United States, even though it has a very impressive military, it didn't stop organized crime from developing their own territories of control in the US. This is a loss of sovereignty over internal areas is a common theme throughout history, whether we are talking about ancient Rome or modern-day Jamaica. The individual stories and economic costs of the US gun culture are horrible. But that might not be the biggest cost for the US. The biggest cost might be the legitimacy and the support for the US nation state itself. I'm Douglas. Thank you for listening.